the boy who became Pharaoh. In the long shadow of the setting sun, when the Nile gleamed like liquid gold and the desert winds carried whispers of eternity, there came a time when Egypt's throne passed not to a seasoned warrior nor a seasoned priest, but to a child. He was frail, his steps uncertain, his body thin as reeds swaying by the riverbanks, yet the weight of the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, was placed upon his shoulders. The boy was perhaps 9 years old when he was carried into the great court, his head adorned with the double crown, his small hands trembling under the burden of the crook and flail, and those who watched from the shadowed colonnades murmured among themselves. For it was not the boy's will that had guided him to the seat of Horus, but the currents of history, the ambitions of those older and stronger than him, and the mysterious hand of destiny. The Egypt he inherited was weary, scarred from the turbulence of the heretic king Akhenaten, who had cast aside the gods of tradition in favor of a single, blazing disk in the sky, the Aten. Akhenaten's revolution had left temples abandoned, priests displaced, and the sacred order disrupted. The people, bound by centuries of ritual and worship, had long felt their world unmoored. Now they turned their eyes to the boy king, whose very presence seemed fragile yet promising, as though Ma'at, the balance of the universe, might once again be restored through him. Yet those same eyes knew he was but a child, and a child could not rule alone. In the corridors of the palace at Memphis and Thebes, great lords whispered. They spoke of guiding the boy's hand, of ensuring that Egypt's order was not lost. Among them were generals who had tasted the iron scent of battle, priests who still remembered the smoke rising from Amun's sanctuaries, and royal women whose line stretched back to queens who had ruled as goddesses in human form. For them, the boy was a vessel, a symbol upon which to project their own hopes and designs. His life was precious, yes, but more precious still was the legitimacy he offered, an unbroken thread to the royal blood of Amarna, that controversial line which still shimmered with divine association despite its stains of heresy. The boy himself, though small and frail, possessed eyes that watched and listened. He was curious, though often withdrawn, as if he bore in silence a weight he could not name. His childhood, once filled with games in the palace gardens and lessons whispered by tutors about the sacred stories of Ra and Osiris, had suddenly transformed into a realm of ritual and ceremony. Each morning he was dressed in linen fine as the sands of Sinai, perfumed with oils, and led into halls carved with images of gods he scarcely yet understood. The crook and flail, when placed in his grasp, seemed heavy, not for their material, but for the burden of generations they represented. He must have wondered, in those early days, what it meant to be Pharaoh. The courtiers told him he was the living Horus, the bridge between men and gods. The priests bowed low, their foreheads touching the polished stone floors, as they spoke his name with reverence. The soldiers saluted him, their bronze weapons catching the light, their voices chanting in unison. Yet when the ceremonies ended, and the boy was returned to the inner chambers of the palace, surrounded only by a few attendants and perhaps his young bride-to-be, Ankhesenamun, he was still but a child, weary from standing so long in sandals too stiff for his tender feet. In the solitude of his chamber, he may have pressed his cheek against the cool alabaster walls, seeking comfort in their silence. Outside, Egypt's vast body stretched from the cataracts in the south to the shores of the Mediterranean in the north, a land rich with barley and papyrus, with lotus blossoms opening at dawn and closing at dusk. The people tilled their fields, fished the Nile, carved stone statues of their gods, and lived with a quiet rhythm older than any king. To them, the boy on the throne was not so much a ruler in truth as a figure of reassurance, a promise that Egypt had not fallen into chaos. As long as a pharaoh sat upon the throne, as long as offerings were made in the temples and the rituals of sunrise and sunset continued, the world still held balance. Yet within the palace, things were more complicated. Decisions needed to be made about the temples that had fallen into neglect, the allies who had been alienated, the enemies at the borders who watched with interest as Egypt passed into the hands of a child. Who would make these decisions, if not the boy himself? Here the figures of Ai, the aged vizier, and Horemheb, the general seasoned in the dust of battle, rose into prominence. They presented themselves as loyal guardians of the throne, protectors of the fragile king. But in the chambers of strategy, they were already shaping Egypt's future in their own likeness. The boy's role was to nod, to speak words taught to him, to lend the golden aura of divinity to the decrees others composed. And still, the boy grew. He learned to sit upon the throne for hours, to receive ambassadors, to smile with a dignity far beyond his years. His tutors instructed him in the myths, how Osiris was slain and resurrected, how Ra travelled each night through the underworld, how the balance of Ma'at must never be broken. These stories sank into his mind like the slow rising of the Nile. Whether he understood them fully or not, they became part of him, as inseparable as the fragrance of lotus from the riverbanks. He was no longer simply a child, he was Pharaoh, even if others moved the pieces on the board. But always, behind the grandeur, there was fragility. He stumbled at times when walking, his limbs thin and awkward. The attendants looked away politely, pretending not to notice, though their hearts tightened with worry. The physicians mixed potions, prepared unguents, whispered charms against evil spirits, but none could alter the frailty that marked his body. And yet, despite this, he carried himself with a quiet courage, as though he knew that his role was not to live long or fight wars, but simply to be the sacred flame that reassured a nation. Thus began the reign of the boy who became Pharaoh, a reign both glittering and fragile, destined to echo across centuries in ways no one then could foresee. For though the sands would one day bury his name, and though his body would vanish into mystery, in that moment he stood at the threshold of eternity, a child wrapped in gold, his face solemn yet innocent, embodying the paradox of Egypt itself, timeless and yet fleeting, powerful and yet vulnerable, eternal and yet ever subject to the winds of fate. Court of Shadows. The boy king sat upon the lion-shaped throne, its gilded arms cold beneath his slight palms, while the cavernous halls around him seemed to echo with footsteps not his own. Though the priests intoned prayers to Amun and the courtiers bent low in reverence, the atmosphere was not one of serene loyalty but of hidden currents, quiet as the Nile at night, yet powerful enough to shape the fate of empires. In the court of this young pharaoh, shadows loomed larger than the light, for though the double crown rested upon his brow, it was not his will alone that guided Egypt. Behind the boy's innocent presence moved men and women seasoned by ambition, their whispers filling the stone chambers like unseen smoke. The vizier, grey of beard and cautious in speech, was one such shadow. He had long served under Akhenaten, and his survival through those turbulent years revealed a talent for patience and maneuvering. To many, he appeared as a grandfatherly figure, his hand steady upon the affairs of state, offering guidance to a child too small for the burdens of sovereignty. Yet in the glances exchanged in council meetings, it was clear A's influence was more than gentle advice. He shaped decrees, steered the court's decisions, and with each passing season wove himself deeper into the web of power that surrounded the throne. Beside him, though often at odds, stood the general Horemheb, hardened by campaigns along the frontiers, broad of shoulders and stern of gaze. He embodied Egypt's military strength. The boy looked upon him with a mixture of awe and fear, for Horemheb carried the air of one who had seen death and commanded it. While I whispered of rituals, offerings and alliances, Horemheb spoke of chariots, battalions, and the need to keep the borders secure. To him, the boy was Pharaoh, yes, but also the key to maintaining order among restless troops and ensuring Egypt's neighbors did not mistake youth for weakness. The court itself was a theater of silence and spectacle. Columns painted with scenes of gods stretched high above the heads of gathered officials, their shadows long upon the polished floors. Courtiers from noble families bowed deeply, though their eyes darted to one another, weighing rivals and allies alike. The boy, seated in dignity beyond his years, often listened more than he spoke, for every word had already been placed in his mouth by those who guided him. Decrees were read aloud, restoring favor to the temples neglected under Akhenaten, returning land to the priesthoods of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu. Each proclamation was praised as the pharaoh's will, though all in the chamber knew it was the work of the shadowed hands behind the throne. It was in the private chambers that the real maneuverings occurred. There, the voices softened into measured whispers, as Eye and Horemheb subtly vied for supremacy. Eye, with his knowledge of ritual and his careful ties to the priesthood, urged a swift restoration of the old gods, promising that such piety would bind the people's loyalty. Horemheb, wary of foreign threats from Hittites and Nubians, pressed for military reform and preparation, warning that without strength in arms, Egypt's glory would crumble no matter how many offerings smoked upon temple altars. Between them stood the boy, silent more often than not, absorbing their arguments, though rarely grasping the full complexity of the choices being made in his name. Yet in the boy's presence, all ambition softened into ceremony. Each morning he was brought forth, anointed with oils, crowned anew, and displayed before the court as the living Horus. He recited the words taught to him, his voice delicate yet resonant in the chamber. The courtiers, kneeling low, repeated his name with reverence, though in their hearts they measured how best to use that divine aura. The boy's image, slender, golden, crowned, was more than a child's body. It was a mask, a symbol, a shield behind which greater forces maneuvered. But there were others in the shadows too, figures less visible yet no less significant. The royal women, descendants of Akhenaten's house, lingered on the edges of power. Chief among them was Ankhesenamun, the young queen, who stood at the boy's side not only as wife but as ally. Though little more than a girl herself, she carried the burden of dynastic continuity, her very presence a reminder that the Amarna line still held sway. Some courtiers bowed to her as to a living goddess. Others whispered that she too was but a pawn, her fate to be entangled in the ambitions of men like Eye and Horemheb. In such a court, nothing was simple. A gift of gold to the temple might also serve as a statement of allegiance to the priesthood. A marriage alliance might also be a subtle act of defiance. A whispered promise could mean salvation for one family and ruin for another. The boy, though cloaked in silks and honored in song, lived within this maze of intentions. Perhaps he sensed, in the quiet hours when attendants left him alone, that he was both pharaoh and captive, the center of a vast game whose rules he had not written. Still, there was a strange strength in his silence. Though frail of body, his presence held an innocence that neither Eye's cunning nor Horemheb's strength could mimic. When he lifted his head, when his eyes met those of his advisers, there was a quiet dignity that silenced even the most calculating tongue. For in that moment all were reminded that though they schemed and whispered, Egypt still had a pharaoh, however small, however young, and that fact alone lent weight to every act, every ritual, every decree. Thus the court of shadows moved around him, priests, generals, courtiers, and queens, each weaving their threads, each hiding their designs behind masks of devotion. And in the midst of it all, the boy king sat, patient, watchful, his figure gilded by torchlight, his destiny already carrying him down a path neither he nor his court yet fully understood. The gods demand restoration. The palace walls carried the scent of incense, and every corridor seemed filled with the murmur of priests, chanting invocations to gods whose names had been silenced for too many years. Egypt, under Akhenaten's revolution, had witnessed the abandonment of temples once thought eternal. The colossal sanctuaries of Amun at Karnak had grown dusty, their offerings neglected, their sacred pools dry. Statues once adorned with garlands of lotus had been defaced, their names erased in favor of the single Aten, the blazing sun disk. To the devout, it had been as though the heartbeat of Egypt had faltered, as though the land itself had been left unguarded, unblessed by the divine order. Now, with a boy seated on the throne, the demand rose louder than ever. Restore the gods, mend the broken covenant, return balance to the universe. Tutankhamun, as he was still called in those early years, listened to the voices around him, though it is doubtful he fully understood the depth of what was asked of him. His courtiers and priests spoke endlessly of Ma'at, the sacred harmony between men, nature, and the divine. They told him that without the favor of the gods, the Nile might cease to flood, the harvests might wither, and the stars might falter in their courses. The boy, frail and impressionable, sat quietly as Vizier Eye and the priests of Thebes painted visions of chaos a world unmoored, where crops failed and enemies triumphed, all because Amun's temples had been abandoned. The child king may have trembled at such visions, yet he accepted their urgency. In his silence, in his small nods, Egypt's return to its old faith was sealed. The restoration began with ritual, solemn and grand. Messengers carried proclamations to every city, announcing that the old gods would once more be honored, their sanctuaries rebuilt, their offerings renewed. Workmen were dispatched to temples long neglected. Their chisels rang against stone, removing the images of the Aten and replacing them with the names of Amun, Mut, Ptah, and Osiris. The priests, who had waited in obscurity during Akhenaten's rule, emerged again in robes of white linen, their heads freshly shaven, their chants rising like the swelling floodwaters of the Nile. Smoke from countless censers spiraled into the air, carrying prayers skyward, a visible sign that the covenant between Egypt and its gods was being woven back together. At Thebes, the great temple of Karnak stirred once more with life. The towering pylons, silent for years, echoed with hymns as sacrifices were laid upon the altars. The boy king was brought there in a golden bark, carried by priests, his slight form clad in ceremonial raiment, his brow heavy with the double crown. As he stood before the colossal statue of Amun, towering above him, with eyes carved to pierce eternity, the crowd gasped and prostrated themselves. The child lifted his arms in the prescribed gesture, words of devotion whispered into his ears by the high priest, and repeated them in a soft but clear voice. That day, Egypt witnessed not just the restoration of a god, but the symbolic rebirth of order itself. Yet behind this sacred spectacle lay the calculations of the court. For the restoration was a means of cementing his alliance with the priesthood, binding the boy's legitimacy to the approval of the gods. For Horemheb, though less enthralled by ritual, it was a way to ensure stability, for he knew that soldiers fought best when their homes were secure, their crops blessed, and their gods satisfied. Even the common people, weary of uncertainty, embraced the return of their familiar pantheon. They whispered prayers of gratitude as they sowed their fields, confident once more that Osiris would guard the cycle of life and death, that Ra's bark would journey safely through the night sky, that Ma'at's feather would weigh justly upon their souls when the time came. In the boy's heart, perhaps there was confusion mingled with awe. To him, the gods were not abstract powers, but presences he felt in the glow of firelight, in the quiet hush of temple chambers, in the trembling of his own frail body, when he was lifted up before statues that dwarfed him 100 times over. He may not have fully understood why Akhenaten had turned away from these deities, nor why they now demanded such fervent restoration, but he felt the weight of their return. At night, when the palace quieted, he may have lain awake wondering if the gods truly looked upon him as their chosen vessel, or if he too was but another pawn in a divine drama stretching beyond mortal comprehension. The renaming of the king marked a turning point. Tutankhaten, the living image of Aten, became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. It was a single word altered, yet with it came the reassertion of the entire traditional order. His very identity was transformed into a testament of loyalty to the restored gods. From then on, every inscription, every proclamation, every festival resounded with his new name, binding him forever to the god whose temples rose higher with each passing year. The shift was not without danger. Devotees of Aten still lingered, their loyalty to Akhenaten's vision unbroken. In hidden courtyards, they whispered of the purity of a single god, of a light beyond all others. To them, the restoration of Amun was a betrayal of truth. The boy king's court, keenly aware of this lingering heresy, acted swiftly to suppress it. Records of Akhenaten's reign were scratched away, his name obliterated from stone. The city he had built, Akhetaten, was left to crumble under the desert sun, its once radiant walls now abandoned to silence. The boy himself may have felt a flicker of unease at this erasure, for Akhenaten was kin, a ghost in his bloodline, but he obeyed the will of his guardians. Egypt demanded restoration, and restoration it would have, even if it meant burying recent memory beneath sand and silence. Thus, the boy king's reign was shaped not by conquest of foreign lands nor by monuments of personal glory, but by this solemn task of repair. The gods, in their multiplicity, were called back to their rightful places, and the people, once adrift, felt anchored again. Yet beneath the hymns and sacrifices, beneath the incense and chisel strokes, lay an undercurrent of fragility. For while Egypt's gods were mighty, their chosen king remained but a child, his health uncertain, his reign dependent not on his own will, but on the ambitions of those who whispered behind the curtain. The restoration was not only of temples and rituals, but of appearances that hid the delicate truth. Egypt's fate balanced upon the slender frame of a boy whose body was already betraying him, even as the gods were restored to glory. Tutankhamun becomes Tutankhamun. The boy king's name was once Tutankhamun, the living image of Aten, a title that still carried the fire of his predecessor's revolution, still bound him to the radiant disk that had eclipsed every other god in Egypt. But in the tide of restoration, names were not merely labels, they were destinies, carved as deeply into the world as hieroglyphs into stone. Thus, the council of priests and advisors decreed that the child's name must change, not only for ceremony, but to seal the return of balance. Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, and with that single transformation, the boy himself became a vessel for the god's return. The ceremony was carried out with grandeur. Within Karnak's vast precinct, beneath the towering pylons painted with scenes of victories and blessings, the boy was brought forth in a gilded litter. The temple court was filled with the scent of burning myrrh and frankincense, their smoke rising like prayers toward the heavens. Priests in white linen and golden collars led him to the sanctuary, where the colossal statue of Amun loomed in silence. The high priest, voice deep as the Nile's current, spoke the words that would bind king and god. Tutankhamun is no more, he declared, for the Aten has waned. Behold Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, child of the divine, chosen of the gods. We ged. The boy repeated the sacred words as they were whispered into his ear, his thin voice trembling but clear. His head was anointed with sacred oils, his body draped in fresh linen as the priests chanted hymns that had not been sung in nearly 2 decades. When he stepped forward and laid a small offering of lotus and gold at Amun's feet, the crowd fell prostrate, their voices rising in a thunderous acclamation. Tutankhamun, Tutankhamun, may he live forever, son of Amun, beloved of the gods. In that moment, Egypt felt reborn, yet the boy himself, though solemn in his role, could not help but feel bewilderment at the change. One day, he had borne a name that linked him to his ancestors' radical devotion. The next, he was remade in the image of a god whose temples stretched wider than palaces, whose priests wielded power as enduring as stone. Perhaps, in the quiet after the ceremony, when he was led back to his chambers and the heavy regalia was lifted from his slight shoulders, he wondered what his true self was beneath these names. Was he Aten's child, Amun's image, or simply a boy swept up in the eternal game of gods and men? The renaming had far-reaching consequences beyond the boy's personal musings. In every corner of Egypt, scribes were dispatched to alter records, chiseling away the old name and carving the new. In distant villages, priests proclaimed the change, assuring the people that Egypt was once more under the favor of Amun, that the heavens would bless the Nile, that Osiris would guard the fields of the dead. The boy's name, inscribed upon scarabs, stelae, and official decrees, became the sacred key to this new order. Tutankhamun was not simply a king, he was the divine signature on the restoration of balance. Yet this divine renaming also deepened the rivalry within the court. I, the vizier, took pride in his role in orchestrating the shift, for it bound his political power to the approval of the priesthood. Horemheb, though less concerned with religious titles, recognized the stability it brought, for a kingdom united under Amun was easier to defend than one divided by heresy. Still, he kept watch, wary of A's growing closeness to the temple, wary that the restoration might strengthen the priests more than the crown itself. The boy, sitting quietly between them, may have sensed their tension, though he could not yet grasp the stakes of the game unfolding around him. And Ankhesenamun, the young queen, stood silently at her husband's side throughout the ceremony. Though still a girl herself, her presence lent legitimacy, for she too was of the Amarna line, daughter of Akhenaten. Some whispered that her heart must have wavered, torn between her father's memory and the new devotion to Amun. But in the eyes of the people, she was radiant, the perfect consort, embodying continuity even as the world shifted. When she walked beside Tutankhamun, her hand lightly touching his, the crowd saw not children but embodiments of divine harmony, the union of bloodlines and gods alike. The change of name marked the beginning of Egypt's healing. Temples reopened, festivals flourished once more, processions carried images of Amun through the streets, where men and women knelt, tossing flowers and raising their arms in praise. The land seemed to breathe again, as if a long drought had broken. And always, at the center of these celebrations, was the boy king, now Tutankhamun, paraded in gilded splendor, his image painted on walls, his name sung in hymns. To the people, he was no longer simply a child. He was the living image of Amun, the sign that the gods had forgiven Egypt and restored their favor. Yet, beneath the hymns and incense, shadows remained, for the boy's health was delicate, his steps uncertain, his face sometimes pale beneath the golden crown. The priests might proclaim him the living image of Amun, but the frailty of his body was a reminder that he was still mortal, still fragile. And in the secret chambers of power, I and Horemheb measured how long this fragile image might endure, and how best to wield it while it lasted. Thus, with a single change of name, a child became a symbol, a living bridge between the chaos of the past and the promise of order restored. Tutankhaten was gone, Tutankhamun lived, and though history would one day erase and rediscover him, in that moment he was both boy and god, shadow and light, innocence and destiny, walking the thin line upon which Egypt itself balanced. The hidden queen, she was scarcely more than a child herself, yet her role was as old as the dynasty and as heavy as the stone of the pyramids. Ankhesenamun, born Ankhesenparten, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, had walked through the upheaval of her father's reign, seen the temples of Amun deserted, the hymns of Aten rise and then fade like sunlight upon the desert. And now, as queen beside the fragile boy king Tutankhamun, she became the silent axis around which dynastic survival turned. To the world, she was radiant consort, young wife, and royal daughter. But behind the gold and painted murals, she bore the loneliness of a woman whose life was bound not to choice, but to necessity. Her presence at court was carefully choreographed. She stood at the boy's side during ceremonies, her hand often brushing his, her figure clad in shimmering linen, a lotus crown upon her head. To the priests and generals, her image completed the scene, the king and queen united, divine couple embodying the balance of Egypt, child, and goddess together. Her youth was hidden behind veils of ritual, her vulnerability masked by the weight of expectation. When the boy's health faltered, when his steps wavered during processions, it was Ankhesenamun who steadied him, her touch disguised as gentle affection, though it was born of necessity. But beyond appearances, Ankhesenamun's role was perilous. As daughter of Akhenaten, she carried the taint of his heresy, yet also the legitimacy of his bloodline. To I and the priests, she was a figure to be managed carefully, indispensable for continuity, but potentially dangerous if she chose to champion her father's abandoned vision. To Horemheb, she was a pawn upon the board, a means of tying the boy king's rule to the Amarna line while ensuring military stability. To the people, she was the beloved queen, though few understood the delicate web of power and survival in which she was ensnared. In the private chambers, perhaps her life felt more like that of a girl than a queen. One imagines her seated beside Tutankhamun in the cool of evening, their attendants withdrawn, speaking softly of things beyond politics, the scent of lotus from the gardens, the cries of herons across the river, the memory of days when they played as children in palaces now half forgotten. Their bond, forged in childhood and sanctified by necessity, was perhaps the only realm in which she was not an instrument of others' designs. And yet, even in such moments, the shadow of destiny pressed heavily upon them both. For her womb was no less a part of Egypt's fate than his crown. Every whisper in the court carried the question of heirs. Without a child, the dynastic line would falter, the throne vulnerable to ambitious men waiting in the wings. Ankhesenamun, still barely a woman, bore that burden silently. Songs were sung of her as the mother of Egypt's future, though the truth was more fragile, her fate more uncertain. Later ages would debate whether she bore children who did not survive, whether miscarriages or infant deaths darkened her secret chambers. The tombs of the valley hold small mummies, tiny remains, some have thought to be her lost daughters, tragic echoes of a legacy that could not take root. In public, however, she remained serene, her painted face glowing with divine beauty, her voice soft yet steady in ritual hymns. She played the role expected of her, the goddess wife who embodied Isis beside Osiris, Hathor beside Ra. The people adored her, perhaps even more than they adored her young husband, for in her presence they saw continuity with the past, a promise that Egypt's royal house was unbroken despite the storms it had weathered. Yet Ankhesenamun herself, behind the painted walls, must have felt the tightening grip of isolation. She was surrounded by men who sought power, I with his measured patience, Horemheb with his iron will, and she was caught between them, her choices narrowed by their designs. Still, she was not without strength. Her very survival, from the turbulence of Akhenaten's revolution to the precarious throne beside Tutankhamun, revealed a will of iron beneath her delicate frame. She knew how to move with dignity, how to guard her words, how to shield her true thoughts behind the mask of devotion. In a court of shadows, she learned to walk unseen, to let others underestimate her, to hide her fears behind the veil of ritual. She was young, yes, but she was not naive. She knew that her place beside the king was both a blessing and a cage, a role that could protect her or destroy her depending on which way the sands of power shifted. For now, she was queen, hidden in plain sight, her fate bound to a boy king whose health was fragile and whose reign was shaped by forces beyond his control. She walked the palace halls with grace, bowed her head during ceremonies, and whispered reassurances to her husband when weariness clouded his eyes. Yet in the silence of night, when the court was hushed and the stars blazed above the desert, she must have wondered what awaited her, whether her life would end as a name on temple walls, as a mother of kings, or as a forgotten shadow, erased by men who sought to rule in her place. Thus the hidden queen endured, a figure both radiant and veiled, carrying the burdens of dynasty, marriage, and survival. Her story would not unfold fully until later, when the boy king's death would leave her standing alone against the ambitions of Egypt's most powerful men. But even now, in the early years of their reign, her presence was the silent anchor of Tutankhamun's throne, the hidden queen whose destiny was entwined with the forgotten secrets of Egypt's most fragile king. The general's watchful eyes, within the gilded silence of the palace, where painted walls told stories of eternal victories and the scent of incense dulled the air, one figure moved with the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to command. Horemheb, general of Egypt's armies, stood as tall and immovable as the statues of stone guardians that lined the temple gates. Where others in the court spoke in whispers, he carried the unspoken weight of steel and discipline, a presence that reminded all who saw him that beyond the rituals of gods and priests, Egypt was a kingdom that survived because men bore spears, marched in lines, and defended its borders with their lives. His eyes, dark and calculating, never strayed far from the fragile figure of the boy king. Horemheb had risen not from divine blood, nor from the priestly class, but from the ranks of soldiers. His was a merit forged in the dust of campaigns, in the long marches through Nubia's deserts, in the tense negotiations with emissaries from the Hittites who pressed against Egypt's northern frontiers. His hands bore the scars of reins and weapons. His voice carried the edge of command. Among the army, he was revered as a leader who shared their hardships, who slept beneath the same stars as his men, who drank the same brackish water when supplies ran thin. But here, in the palace halls, his strength was translated into silence and watchfulness, his authority folded carefully beneath the veneer of courtly obedience. For Horemheb understood that Egypt's throne, though now occupied by a child, was still the axis of the two lands. To protect it was to protect Egypt, to control it was to control destiny itself. And so he watched I, the vizier with his polished words and alliances with priests. He watched the queen, young Ankhesenamun, whose lineage tied her to the Amarna line. He watched the courtiers, shifting like reeds in the current of power. But above all, he watched Tutankhamun. Every stumble the boy made, every cough, every pallor upon his face was noted in Horemheb's silent ledger of concerns, for he knew that a kingdom's enemies would see weakness in such fragility, and weakness invited invasion. In council meetings, his voice was low but firm. When priests spoke of rebuilding temples and restoring rituals, Horemheb spoke of battalions and border patrols. "The Hittites grow bold," he would remind them, his tone clipped. "They see a boy upon the throne. They will test us if we do not remind them that Egypt still commands the field." His words were seldom ignored, for though I held sway in the shadows of the temples, Horemheb held sway in the dust of the battlefield, and the court knew that Egypt's might rested not only upon gods but upon soldiers. And yet, beneath his stern demeanor, Horemheb harbored ambition. He had tasted power in command, and in the corridors of the palace he began to imagine it not only on the field but upon the throne itself. Still, he was patient. He knew that overt haste was dangerous, that Egypt still needed the fragile boy to serve as a divine shield behind which real power could be exercised. For now, he would serve, loyal in appearance, vigilant in truth, letting others believe that his watchfulness was devotion alone. But in his heart, he was already measuring the weight of the crown, already seeing himself not as protector but as heir. The boy king himself regarded Horemheb with mingled awe and apprehension. When the general entered the chamber, his broad frame filling the space, his armor glinting faintly even when polished for ceremony, Tutankhamun felt both reassured and overshadowed. This was a man who commanded thousands, who knew the cries of battle, who carried the strength that the boy's frail body could never muster. Perhaps Tutankhamun admired him, perhaps he feared him, perhaps both. In the boy's eyes, Horemheb was like a statue come to life, an embodiment of Egypt's enduring strength, unwavering, unbreakable, yet never quite a figure of warmth. Outside the palace, the people too heard whispers of the general's watchfulness. They knew his name, though not his face, and they spoke of him as the arm of Egypt, the sword that would keep the Nile safe from foreign kings. Songs in the taverns of Memphis and Thebes praised his victories, even as they sang hymns to Tutankhamun. The boy was the divine image, Horemheb was the earthly shield. Together, in the people's minds, they formed a balance, though those closer to power understood that balance was fragile, and that in the general's eyes, the throne was not only to be protected but one day, perhaps, to be claimed. In the dim torchlight of evening councils, when shadows flickered along the carved walls, Horemheb's gaze would sometimes linger on the boy longer than was necessary, as though measuring his fragility against the weight of the kingdom. To others, it seemed loyalty. To Horemheb himself, it was calculation. For Egypt was vast, its enemies many, and its throne too important to be left to chance. He would serve faithfully, yes, but always with his eyes open, always with his mind turned toward the horizon, where battles yet to come would decide not only the fate of the two lands, but perhaps the fate of his own ambitions. Thus, in the court of shadows, where priests whispered and queens endured, the general's watchful eyes remained ever fixed upon the boy king, steady as the stars over the desert. And though Tutankhamun was the image of Amun, it was Horemheb's vigilance that gave Egypt the strength to believe that its fragile king would endure. Whether that vigilance was born of loyalty or of hunger for power, none could yet say. But in the stillness of those torchlit halls, the general's gaze never faltered, and in its silence lay the future of Egypt, gifts of the Nile. The river was Egypt's lifeblood, and in Tutankhamun's reign, for a brief and shining moment, it seemed as though the Nile remembered its ancient covenant with the land. The waters rose as they were meant to, neither too low to starve the crops, nor too high to destroy the fields. Year after year, the black silt spread across the floodplain, rich and generous, a gift from the gods to reassure a weary people that balance was returning. To those who labored in the sun, bending their backs over barley and flax, it seemed that the restoration of Amun's favor was not mere ritual, it was reality. The gods, once neglected, were smiling again. In the villages, life blossomed with quiet abundance. Farmers sang as they sowed seeds, their voices carrying across the green expanse of the floodplain. Children played along the riverbanks, shaping little boats of papyrus and sending them adrift on the gentle current. Fishermen returned with baskets full of Nile perch, and herders guided their cattle through the lush pastures. The ordinary people of Egypt, who cared little for the whispered rivalries of Ai and Horemheb, cared deeply that their bellies were full and their households secure. To them, the boy king, even if frail and unseen, was the divine vessel who had brought them peace. The temples, too, thrived in this season of abundance. With resources once more plentiful, priests oversaw the repair of sanctuaries long neglected. Stonemasons cut fresh blocks from the quarries, hauling them by sledges to rebuild walls and pylons. Painters filled the restored chambers with brilliant colors, blue like the midday sky, red like the desert sun, green like the fields after the flood. Images of Amun, Osiris, Hathor, and countless other gods returned to prominence, carved and painted with renewed devotion. The sound of hymns once again echoed in sanctuaries, accompanied by the rhythmic clapping of sistrums and the low hum of drums. For the priests, these were not only acts of worship but acts of healing. Egypt's very soul was being stitched back together, and at the heart of this renewal was the boy king, carried forth in gilded procession, his fragile frame hidden beneath robes of gold-threaded linen. His face, though often pale, shone with the solemnity expected of Pharaoh, and the people responded with joy when they glimpsed him. When he raised his hand in blessing, they bowed their heads, murmuring prayers of gratitude. Though it was I and the council who organized these spectacles, it was Tutankhamun's presence that gave them meaning. He was the symbol of the god's favor, the visible proof that Ma'at, the balance of the world, had been restored. Even Horemheb, ever watchful for threats, recognized the importance of this peace. For a time, he set aside his anxieties about foreign encroachment, turning his energies to organizing Egypt's defenses quietly, without disrupting the sense of calm that the boy king's reign projected. The army trained along the borders, but there were no great campaigns, no desperate battles. Instead, soldiers were seen marching in festivals, their presence a reassurance rather than a reminder of war. It was as if Egypt had exhaled after a long-held breath, grateful to live not in constant turmoil but in the gentle rhythm of the Nile. Ankhesenamun, too, flourished in this season. At festivals, she walked beside her husband, her beauty celebrated in hymns, her grace compared to Hathor's. Women of the villages looked to her as the embodiment of fertility and hope, praying that her womb would bring forth heirs to secure the dynasty. Though tragedy may have lurked in the shadows of her chambers, tiny lives lost before they could grow, her public presence remained serene. She smiled gently as children tossed lotus flowers at her feet, as women raised their infants for her blessing. In her, the people saw not sorrow but promise. The court, for all its rivalries, found itself momentarily unified in the face of prosperity. Ai's careful management of the priesthood, Horemheb's disciplined watch over the borders, the boy's quiet dignity, the queen's radiant presence, all these elements combined into a fragile harmony. Egypt seemed to hum with life, its people lulled by the gifts of the river, its rulers secure in the knowledge that the gods were with them. And yet, beneath the surface, the fragility remained. The boy's health, though hidden beneath ceremony, did not strengthen with the abundance of the land. At times he faltered during long rituals, leaning subtly upon Ankhesenamun's hand. At other times he was carried in secret back to his chambers, leaving the priests to assure the people that all was well. Egypt's peace was real, its gifts plentiful, but the foundation of this harmony rested upon a boy who could not fully share in its vigor. Still, for the people who sowed the barley and harvested the flax, who offered prayers at dawn and sang songs at dusk, this was an age of blessing. They remembered the upheavals of the heretic king, the silenced temples, the uncertainty that had clouded the land. Compared to those days, Tutankhamun's reign was like the cool shadow of a palm tree after the burning desert Sunday. The Nile's waters glistened, the crops grew, the gods were honored, and Egypt thrived. It was an illusion of permanence, a season of plenty that felt as though it might last forever. But the river, for all its constancy, also carried change in its current. Just as the floodwaters rose and fell, so too would Egypt's fortunes. For though the land was at peace, the frailty of the boy king lingered like a shadow, waiting for its hour to darken the gifts of the Nile. The illness within, even as Egypt flourished under the steady rhythm of the Nile, within the palace walls there lingered a truth that no hymns or processions could erase. The boy king, dressed in linen finer than river mist and crowned with the golden diadem of Horus, bore in his fragile body the secret of decline. His youth, which should have promised vigor and strength, was instead marked by frailty. Those who attended him, daily servants, physicians, and the quiet queen at his side, saw what the public could not. They saw the trembling of his limbs when he rose too quickly, the pallor beneath his painted cheeks, the way his steps faltered even in the shortest of processions. They knew that beneath the golden perfumes, Pharaoh was sickly, and that the sickness was not one that could be banished by incense or prayer. The physicians of the court, learned men who mixed remedies from honey, lotus, and desert herbs, whispered of afflictions in his bones, of pain that seized his steps, of fevers that burned without warning. Some believed the curse of consanguinity haunted the Amarna line, for brother had married sister, and daughter had been given to father, and such unions, though divine in the eyes of ritual, brought weakness into the flesh. Others blamed the Aten's heresy, declaring that the gods had punished Akhenaten's offspring with fragile bodies. The priests nodded gravely at such explanations, eager to weave the king's illness into their narrative of divine justice and restoration. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Tutankhamun's body, though crowned with eternity, was made of flesh that faltered. On certain days, he seemed almost ordinary. He laughed softly at the antics of musicians who played for him, or listened with wonder to stories whispered by his tutors of Osiris and Set, of Isis and Horus. In such moments, one could almost forget the shadow of illness, but then the pain would return, sudden as a desert wind. His attendants would see his brow tighten, his hands tremble, his body collapse into a chair, as though the weight of the crown had suddenly tripled. Ankhesenamun, ever vigilant, would move quickly to shield him from watchful eyes, arranging her presence to disguise his weakness. To the courtiers, it appeared a gesture of intimacy. Only those closest to him knew it was an act of protection. The general Horemheb watched with a soldier's eye, his concern never softened by sentiment. He noted the boy's frailty as one would note a weakness in the defences of a fortress. For him, the king's body was more than mortal, it was the embodiment of Egypt's strength, and each stumble, each illness, was a vulnerability the Hittites or Nubians might one day exploit. Yet Horemheb held his tongue, for he knew the truth must not be spoken aloud. To admit the pharaoh was weak was to invite chaos. By contrast, cloaked his watchfulness in ritual piety. He urged more offerings to Amun, more ceremonies to bind the king's health to divine favor. Each illness became an opportunity for him to increase the priesthood's influence, to reinforce that only through devotion could Egypt's fate be secured. To the boy himself, Ai's reassurances may have sounded comforting, though they were also heavy with unspoken control. And what of the boy's own thoughts? In the stillness of his chambers, when attendants withdrew and the oil lamps flickered low, perhaps Tutankhamun pondered his frailty with the curiosity and fear of a child. He was told he was the living Horus, the son of Ra, the divine bridge between gods and men, yet his body betrayed him with pain, with weakness, with the ever-present possibility of death. Did he wonder, as he lay awake, whether the gods had truly chosen him? Or did he wonder if he was but a vessel soon to be discarded, his body unfit for the eternity promised in the hymns? The people beyond the palace knew none of this. They saw their king in festivals, borne upon gilded litters, his face painted with divine radiance. They sang his name as though it would last forever, praising him for the abundance of the Nile, for the restoration of the gods, for the peace that filled their days. They did not see the moments when he collapsed in private, when he leaned heavily on Ankhesenamun's hand, when he whispered to his physicians in tones laced with pain. For them, Tutankhamun was eternal, untouched by the frailties that afflicted ordinary men. But in truth, the illness within was a shadow that grew with each passing season. The boy, though still alive, carried death close to him, as though it walked a step behind him in every procession. Egypt flourished on the surface, its gods restored, its river generous. Yet beneath this golden calm lay the reality that its pharaoh was fragile, that the heart of its order beat within a body that might falter at any moment. The court whispered in silence, priests prayed with fervor, generals watched with narrowed eyes, for all knew that one day, perhaps sooner than they dared to admit, the illness within might claim the boy king, and with him the delicate balance of Egypt's restored harmony. Whispers of conspiracy. The palace was a place of polished stone and gilded splendor, yet beneath its painted ceilings and perfumed air, whispers slithered like serpents in the reeds. Egypt's peace was a delicate veil, and behind it lay ambition, envy, and fear. The boy king, frail though crowned in gold, was the axis upon which the kingdom turned. Should he falter, the balance would shatter. Those who bent the knee in public now began to murmur in private, and the illness that shadowed Tutankhamun's life gave rise to questions none dared ask aloud. What would happen when the boy was gone? It began as cautious speculation, spoken only in the most trusted circles. Servants overheard fragments as they poured wine, or as they swept the chambers at dawn. The boy's cough, the weakness in his step, the paleness of his face, each was seized upon as an omen. Some courtiers muttered that the gods would soon reclaim him, others that his reign was never meant to endure, and in the silences that followed, darker questions arose. Who would rule after him? Whose hand would guide Egypt if the boy king's life ended abruptly? I, the vizier, loomed in these whispers, his long years in service giving him both seniority and the trust of the priesthood. Many believed he was already the true ruler, the boy no more than a ceremonial figure through whom I's will was enacted. His enemies, however, muttered that such power bred greed, that the old man might wish not only to serve but to reign. Some claimed he would do anything to ensure that outcome, even hasten the boy's death if necessary. Horemheb too was a figure of speculation. His watchful eyes, his iron hand upon the army, made him both protector and potential usurper. If the boy died, could Horemheb accept another man upon the throne, or would he march his soldiers from the borders into the heart of Thebes, seizing power not with ritual but with the blade? His silence on such matters was read in 100 ways, by some as loyalty, by others as calculation. Even Ankhesenamun, young though she was not free of suspicion. Some whispered that she, desperate and alone, might seek an alliance beyond Egypt's borders, for the survival of her lineage, if not her husband's. Others suggested that in the darkness of the palace she might be pressed into complicity by stronger wills, her consent irrelevant, her fate entangled in plots devised by men who measured her only as a vessel of dynastic continuity. And so, conspiracy became the unspoken undercurrent of Tutankhamun's reign. Each faltering step he took in public was measured not only with concern, but with calculation. If he died, who would stand in his place? If he lived, who would endure long enough to rule after him? In the hush of night, servants carried rumors through the city like sparks, each tale distorted yet alive. A cup of wine laced with poison, a physician bribed, a fall from a chariot not by chance but by design. No one knew which stories were true, but the whispers themselves eroded trust, leaving a court where every glance might conceal intent, every bow hide ambition. The boy, too, must have sensed the currents swirling about him. Though still young, he was not blind. He saw the way courtiers stiffened when he faltered, the way his advisers exchanged glances when his illness deepened. Perhaps he even heard echoes of the whispers himself, though none would dare speak them in his presence. To be both pharaoh and child was to carry a double weight, one of divinity, one of vulnerability. He knew that his throne was both sacred and perilous, and that the very men who bowed to him might also be the ones who measured his life like a candle flickering low. And so the palace, though outwardly radiant with rituals and festivals, was inwardly tense, its walls listening to secrets, its floors bearing the weight of quiet schemes. Conspiracies may never have taken form in open rebellion, but the readiness for them lived in every cautious glance, every careful silence. Egypt's peace depended upon the survival of a boy whose body betrayed him daily, and the uncertainty of his future invited ambition into the hearts of those who believed they could shape what came next. Thus the whispers grew, soft but steady, like the rustle of reeds along the Nile in the night wind. The illness within had weakened not only the boy but the certainty of the kingdom, and in that uncertainty conspiracies took root. Whether true or imagined, they cast long shadows across the court, preparing the way for the abrupt and mysterious end that would soon silence Tutankhamun's reign and plunge Egypt into yet deeper intrigue. The sudden end. The reign of the boy king, so fragile and yet so luminous, came to its close, not with the grandeur of a triumphant march or the solemnity of an aged pharaoh dying in his palace, but with a suddenness that startled even those who had long watched his faltering health. One day he was still carried in procession, the double crown upon his head, his thin hand raised in blessing. The next, the palace whispered of his collapse, of fever that would not break, of a silence that settled heavily in his chambers. It was as though the flame of a lamp, flickering weakly in the desert wind, had at last been snuffed out, leaving darkness in its place. The circumstances of his death were shrouded in ambiguity, even to those who lived close to it. Some claimed it was a swift illness, a fever that consumed him in days, leaving his body pale and still. Others whispered of an accident, a fall from a chariot, the broken bones hidden beneath his ceremonial wrappings. Still others, more daring in their suspicion, spoke of darker causes of poison slipped into his drink, of a blow dealt in secrecy, of hands that hastened the end for the sake of power. The truth was never written clearly in stone, and so Egypt was left with speculation, as if the gods themselves had veiled the boy's departure in mystery. Within the palace, grief was expressed with ritual precision. Women wailed and tore their garments, priests chanted the hymns of Osiris, and incense filled the halls so thickly that even sorrow was cloaked in its perfume. Ankhesenamun, his queen, stood stricken, her youth shadowed by the sudden weight of widowhood. She had steadied him through ceremonies, had shielded him from prying eyes when his strength failed, and now she was left with nothing but silence, her hand empty, her future uncertain. The priests guided her into the rituals of mourning, but the emptiness in her gaze betrayed a grief too personal to be absorbed entirely into ritual. Ai and Horemheb moved swiftly in the aftermath. They knew that Egypt could not afford hesitation. The throne must not stand vacant, for chaos lurked wherever the seat of Horus was unfilled. Each man positioned himself carefully, cloaking ambition in the garb of duty. Ai presided over the arrangements for burial, ensuring that the priests of Amun were honored and that the boy would be carried into the afterlife with proper ceremony. Horemheb, with soldiers at his command, ensured that order was maintained, that no faction seized the moment to stir rebellion or assert rival claims. Their rivalry remained quiet but sharpened, as though Tutankhamun's death had stripped away the last pretense of unity. The people, when they heard of their king's passing, responded with sorrow that mingled with unease. He had been frail, yes, but he was Pharaoh, and his reign had seemed to mark the return of order after years of upheaval. To lose him so suddenly was to fear that the gods might once again be withdrawing their favor. Across villages and cities, men and women lit small lamps in their homes, praying that Osiris would receive their young ruler kindly, that the cycle of rebirth would hold true for him as for all. They spoke his name softly in their prayers, though already some courtiers were working to erase it from stone, as if his reign were a fragile dream best forgotten. In the royal chambers, Tutankhamun's body was prepared swiftly. Time pressed, for the Valley of the Kings was already filled with the monuments of greater rulers, and his unexpected death left little opportunity for grandeur. His burial would be modest by comparison, hurried in execution, though still adorned with treasures fit for a king. The embalmers worked in secrecy, their hands guided by tradition, yet even their craft seemed to falter, as if disturbed by the haste or by forces less natural. Later generations would puzzle over the strange burns upon his body, the oddities in his mummification, wondering whether accident, incompetence, or something more deliberate had marred the process. In that moment, however, all was hidden beneath wrappings of linen and prayers of protection. Thus, the boy who had once been paraded in golden splendor was reduced to silence, his frail body bound for eternity. His reign ended before it had truly begun. Egypt, still outwardly calm, trembled inwardly with uncertainty. The gods had been restored, the Nile had been generous, yet the king through whom this renewal had been embodied was gone, taken swiftly, his death a mystery even to those closest to him. The sudden end left behind more than grief. It left behind questions, ambitions, and fears. Who had gained from his death? Who would now claim the throne? And would the restoration he had symbolized endure? Or would Egypt once again be thrown into the chaos from which he had seemed to deliver it? No answers came, only the silence of the tomb being prepared in haste, the echo of wailing fading through the palace corridors, and the shadow of conspiracies that deepened with the boy king's final breath. The silent tomb. The death of the boy king was sudden, and so too was the necessity of his burial. Unlike the great pharaohs, who had spent decades preparing their eternal houses in the Valley of the Kings, vast labyrinths carved into stone, filled with chambers for treasures, spells, and offerings, Tutankhamun's tomb was hurried, improvised, and modest by comparison. He had been too young to have envisioned his own eternal dwelling, too fragile to have commissioned the grand monuments that proclaimed power across centuries, and so the court, pressed by time and by fear of disorder, took what they could, a smaller tomb, perhaps originally meant for a lesser noble, reshaped swiftly into a resting place for a king. The valley lay silent, the cliffs rising like guardians of stone around the sacred necropolis. Workmen toiled in secrecy under the watch of priests and guards, their chisels striking against limestone by the light of oil lamps. Passages were hastily widened, chambers plastered and painted in a style that betrayed both beauty and haste. Scenes of gods guiding the pharaoh to eternity were brushed with quick strokes, colors fresh, but lacking the depth of older, grander tombs. The walls whispered of eternity, yet they also bore the mark of urgency, as though time itself had pursued the workmen into the darkness of the rock. The boy's body, wrapped in linen and guarded by spells, was carried into the tomb in silence. Priests recited the sacred words from the Book of the Dead, their voices echoing in the narrow chambers. May you walk in the fields of reeds. May you rise with Ra. May you be embraced by Osiris. The incense smoke curled through the air, mingling with the scent of newly cut stone. Each step deeper into the tomb was both a farewell and a prayer, a promise that though his life had been brief, his eternity would endure. Around him were placed treasures hastily gathered, yet still dazzling in their splendor. Chariots with gilded frames, though perhaps never ridden by his fragile body, were folded into the small chambers. Fine alabaster vessels held unguents and perfumes, baskets of food, garlands of dried flowers, and carved statues of gods crowded the spaces. Most striking of all were the golden shrines and the nested coffins, culminating in the mask that would one day become the most famous visage of ancient Egypt. A serene face of gold and lapis, the boy's features idealized into eternity. The treasures overflowed the cramped rooms, piled almost haphazardly, as though abundance had been pressed into spaces too small to contain it. Ankhesenamun's role in these rituals remains only in faint echoes. One imagines her walking in solemn procession behind the body, her garments torn in mourning, her voice raised in ritual lament. She was young, and yet she embodied the ancient role of Isis, mourning Osiris, the goddess wife guiding her husband into the afterlife. Her grief, though veiled in ceremony, must have been raw, for she was now left alone in a court filled with rivals, her future uncertain. In the tomb, perhaps she lingered longer than others, her hand brushing the sarcophagus, whispering words of farewell no priest would record. I presided over much of the burial, ensuring that the rituals were complete and the gods appeased. To the priests, it seemed fitting an old servant of the royal line guiding the boy into eternity. Yet even then, some whispered that his presence was less of devotion than of calculation, that I was already positioning himself as the one who would succeed, using the solemnity of the burial to cloak his claim in the aura of divine order. Horemheb, though absent from much of the ritual, ensured that guards protected the valley, that the sanctity of the burial was not violated even as the work was rushed. When the last chants were spoken, when the last torches were withdrawn, the tomb was sealed. Heavy stones blocked the entrance, plaster smoothed over them, and seals pressed into the surface bore the name of the necropolis guardians. In the silence that followed, the Valley of the Kings reclaimed its stillness, the cliffs rising in eternal watch. Tutankhamun, who had lived a brief, fragile life beneath the weight of crowns and gods, was now enclosed in darkness, surrounded by golden prayers, his voice silenced but his presence preserved. Yet even then, questions lingered. The tomb was too small, the preparation too hurried. The embalming bore marks of strangeness, burns upon the body, flaws in the wrappings, anomalies in the oils used. These would puzzle future ages, sparking theories of accident, incompetence, or conspiracy. But in that moment, what mattered was only that the boy king had been laid to rest, his soul guided toward Osiris, his name spoken in ritual tones, his treasures sealed away for eternity. The silent tomb became his world, a chamber of shadows and splendor, forgotten quickly by the living even as it endured in stone. The court turned back to politics, the people returned to their harvests, and the valley closed its secrets within itself. Yet the boy's presence remained, waiting across centuries, hidden beneath dust and rock, until the day when strangers from a distant age would break the seals and rediscover what had been buried in haste and silence. Ankhesenamun's desperate letter. When the tomb was sealed and the last echoes of lamentation faded from the valley, the living queen returned to a palace that no longer held meaning. Ankhesenamun, scarcely out of childhood, found herself thrust into the role of widow. The boy who had been her companion, her husband, her fragile partner in a reign built on appearances, was gone. She had played the role of Isis mourning Osiris in ritual, but beyond the gilded masks and hymns, her grief was raw, and her terror even sharper. For in a court now filled with ambitious men, I with his patient cunning, Horemheb with his soldier's will, she was a lone figure of legitimacy, a young woman whose bloodline bound her to the throne, but whose power was as fragile as a reed in the current. It was in this moment of desperation that she conceived of something extraordinary, something no queen of Egypt had ever attempted. She reached beyond the Nile, beyond the two lands, to a foreign court. On papyrus, in words that trembled with both courage and despair, she wrote to Suppiluliuma, the great king of the Hittites in Anatolia. The letter, carried by messengers across deserts and mountains, spoke plainly, "My husband has died. I have no son. They say you have many sons. If you give me one of your sons, he shall be my husband, and I shall make him king of Egypt. Never shall I take a servant of mine and make him my husband, I am afraid." Those words, preserved in later Hittite records, reveal the heart of her plight. She feared what awaited her if she submitted to Ai or Horemheb. To marry one of them would be to surrender her throne, to become an ornament to another man's ambition. But if she could bring a foreign prince to Egypt, she might preserve her dignity, her independence, and the continuity of her line. It was a gamble desperate in its boldness, for never before had Egypt invited a foreigner to sit upon the throne of Horus. Yet desperation often births the unthinkable. The letter astonished Suppiluliuma. To him, Egypt was a rival, a land of gold and power. That its queen should write so humbly, offering her hand to one of his sons, was almost beyond belief. He doubted at first, suspecting trickery. They would not act in such a way, he is recorded as saying. Never before has a queen of Egypt written to me thus. He sent envoys to confirm the truth, and when the queen repeated her plea, he relented. A son, Prince Zananza, was chosen, prepared to journey south and claim the most powerful throne in the ancient world. But the journey never ended. Somewhere along the way, whether in the desert paths or the borderlands of Egypt, Zananza was slain. Hittite records seethe with outrage, blaming the Egyptians for betrayal. Who ordered the prince's death is unknown, whether Ai, fearful of losing his chance at the throne, Horemheb, unwilling to see Egypt ruled by a foreigner, or some other faction determined to preserve Egypt's purity. What is certain is that Ankhesenamun's desperate gamble collapsed into tragedy. In Egypt, whispers of her letter circulated like smoke. Some condemned her as faithless, willing to betray her land for her own survival. Others pitied her, seeing in her actions the courage of a woman fighting against the inevitability of being consumed by men's ambitions. But the court did not forgive such daring. Ai moved swiftly, declaring himself Pharaoh, binding Ankhesenamun to him, perhaps even forcing her into marriage to secure his legitimacy. The young queen who had once dreamed of preserving her dignity was now a shadow, her voice silenced, her fate erased from the records as though she had never lived. And yet, the letter remained a fragile piece of evidence preserved not by Egyptians, who buried her memory, but by the Hittites, who kept the record of her plea. It is the only moment where her own voice pierces across the centuries, unmediated by priests or courtiers, revealing the heart of a woman caught in the storm of empire. In those lines, we glimpse her desperation, her intelligence, her courage. She knew the walls of the palace were closing in, and she reached outward with the only tool she had, her words. Ankhesenamun's letter is one of history's strangest echoes, a cry across borders that altered the fates of nations. It sowed mistrust between Egypt and the Hittites, it revealed fractures within the court, and it marked the final appearance of her name in history. After that, she vanished, as though swallowed by silence. Whether she lived as I's consort, whether she was cast aside, whether she met some darker fate, we cannot say. The sands buried her story, leaving only the fragile papyrus that carried her desperate plea to a distant king. Thus, in the aftermath of Tutankhamun's death, the hidden queen revealed her strength in one last act of defiance, reaching for a path that might free her from the grip of ambition that surrounded her. And though that act failed, though it ended in blood and silence, it remains one of the most haunting fragments of Egypt's forgotten secrets. The voice of a young woman who, for a brief moment, tried to shape her destiny against the tides of men and gods alike. The vanishing bride. After her desperate letter to the Hittite king, Ankhesenamun seemed to vanish into the silence of history, as though she had been swallowed by the very walls of the palace that once elevated her. One day, she was Queen of Egypt, daughter of Akhenaten, wife of Tutankhamun, the young woman whose words had reached across empires. The next, her name disappeared from inscriptions, her image faded from monuments, and her fate became a riddle that has haunted the ages. What happened to the widow of the boy king? The possibilities whisper like ghosts in the halls of memory. Some say that the wizened vizier, forced her to marry him in order to secure his legitimacy when he claimed the throne. A ring found centuries later, bearing the names of both and Ankhesenamun, suggests such a union may have occurred. Yet the silence that follows is striking. If she had indeed been his consort, why does she vanish so completely from records thereafter? Queens were often immortalized beside their husbands, their names carved into temples, their likenesses preserved in statues. But for Ankhesenamun, there is nothing, no grand inscription, no monument, no enduring legacy. It is as though her memory was deliberately erased. Others imagine a darker fate. Perhaps wary of her bloodline and her earlier attempt to ally with the Hittites, sought to remove her entirely once she had served her purpose. The vanishing of her name could be a deliberate act of damnatio memoriae, the erasure of a person from history to protect the throne from the stain of dissent. Or perhaps her life ended suddenly, her death shrouded in secrecy, her body interred in silence without the grandeur usually afforded a queen. There are even those who whisper that she defied that she resisted his attempt to claim her as wife, and that her resistance cost her everything. The letter she wrote to the Hittites had revealed her independence, her refusal to be bound to a servant of her household. Such words, though brave, might have doomed her, for they exposed her unwillingness to submit to the very men who now controlled Egypt. In a court where power tolerated no defiance, her courage may have sealed her disappearance. For Horemheb, her vanishing was convenient. The general, biding his time, had little use for a queen tied so closely to the Amarna line. Her absence cleared the path for his eventual rise, free of the complications her presence might have brought. The priests, too, may have preferred her silence. She was the daughter of Akhenaten, after all, a living reminder of the heresy that had scarred Egypt. To erase her was to erase the lingering shadow of that turbulent reign. And yet, despite the silence of monuments, Ankhesenamun lingers in imagination. One can picture her wandering the palace in those final days, her face veiled, her steps light upon the polished stone floors, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had no allies left. The girl who once stood radiant beside Tutankhamun in festivals, who steadied his trembling hands and whispered comfort in his illness, was reduced to a figure of isolation. Perhaps she stood at the palace windows, gazing across the Nile at the golden cliffs of the valley, where her husband lay entombed, whispering to him across the distance. Perhaps she prayed to Hathor or Isis, asking to be spared from the grip of men who sought to control her fate. Or perhaps she resigned herself, her silence becoming her final act of endurance. Her story becomes, in the end, an unfinished line, a name abruptly cut from the scrolls of history. Later, ages would stumble upon fragments the letter preserved in Hittite archives, the ring bearing A's and her names, the absence where her monuments should have stood, and from these weave endless speculation. But the truth remains hidden, buried beneath the sands and the silence of the ages. To speak of Ankhesenamun is to speak of vanishing, of a queen who dared to write beyond Egypt's borders, who dared to dream of a destiny shaped by her own will, and who paid for that daring with erasure. Her life, though brief and shadowed, embodies the tragedy of a woman caught between gods and men, between dynastic duty and personal survival. She was both visible and invisible, powerful and powerless, remembered and forgotten. And so the vanishing bride remains one of Egypt's most haunting mysteries. She disappears into silence, leaving behind only the faintest echoes, a letter, a ring, a rumor. Yet in those echoes we glimpse the outline of her courage, her desperation, and her fate. She is the bride who vanished, the queen erased, the woman whose voice reached across empires, only to be silenced within her own. Ai takes the crown. In the silence that followed Tutankhamun's burial and Ankhesenamun's vanishing, Egypt turned its weary eyes to the old vizier Ai. For years he had been the quiet counselor, the steady presence in the shadows, the hand that guided decrees through the boy king's lips. Now, at the twilight of his life, Ai stepped forward to claim openly what he had long held in secret, the throne of Egypt. The moment was cloaked in solemnity, but beneath the rituals, all who watched knew that the transition was less of divine destiny and more of careful maneuvering. Ai presented himself as the guardian of continuity, the faithful servant who had ensured Egypt's survival through the fragile reign of a child. He was no warrior like Horemheb, no young heir of royal blood, yet he had proximity to the throne, years of service, and perhaps even a hastily arranged marriage to Ankhesenamun, tying him to the royal line by the thinnest of threads. In the absence of a stronger claim, it was enough. The priests, ever pragmatic, supported him, for Ai had been their ally during the restoration of Amun's supremacy. With their blessing, the crown was placed upon his head, and the old man who had outlived generations of kings became pharaoh. His coronation was a spectacle of tradition. The double crown was lifted high, the crook and flail placed in his hands, and hymns resounded through Karnak and Luxor. Priests intoned that the gods themselves had chosen him, that Ma'at had guided Egypt to this moment. Yet the people must have looked upon him with mixed feelings. Where Tutankhamun had been youthful, fragile, and beloved for his innocence, Ai was aged, lined with years, a man whose reign promised not new beginnings, but the continuation of old ambitions. Still, for ordinary Egyptians, what mattered was not the man but the office. A pharaoh sat upon the throne. The order of the world was preserved. Behind the rituals, however, Ai's legitimacy was fragile. He knew it, and so did his rivals. Horemheb, commander of the armies, did not contest the succession openly, but his silence was heavy with promise. The general bided his time, letting Ai rule, waiting for age and mortality to do what politics could not. Ai, in turn, ensured that Horemheb was kept at a distance, limiting his influence while surrounding himself with allies among the priesthood. The court, divided between soldiers and priests, became a stage for a contest. Neither side wished to ignite openly, but both prepared for in silence. The figure of Ankhesenamun, if she remained alive, faded almost entirely from view. If indeed Ai had married her, it was less a union of hearts than a political maneuver, a way to lend his rule a veneer of legitimacy. Yet her voice disappears after this, her presence erased from inscriptions, her role minimized until even her existence became uncertain. In this, Ai's reign symbolized the triumph of control over continuity, a reign where appearances mattered more than truth, where the silence of a queen was more useful than her voice. Ai's rule was brief, lasting only a handful of years, and it bore none of the vigor of great pharaohs. He was too old to lead campaigns, too entrenched in priestly ritual to innovate, too cautious to build monuments that would last through ages. His legacy was less in what he accomplished and more in what he represented: the survival of Egypt through cunning and adaptation, even when divine bloodlines faltered. He kept the temples filled, the priests satisfied, and the semblance of stability intact. In this way, he maintained the fragile balance left by Tutankhamun, though it was clear to all that his reign was a stopgap, a bridge between the past and a future yet to be seized. When I died, his tomb was prepared with modest splendor, far less magnificent than those of the kings he had served. He was buried with the trappings of Pharaoh, but his name never carried the same weight as those who had truly shaped Egypt's destiny. In time, even his monuments would be usurped, his memory overshadowed by stronger figures who came after. But for a brief moment, in the wake of a boy king's sudden death, I held the crown, a reminder that in Egypt, power often belonged not to the chosen but to the patient. Thus, A's reign closed, the chapter begun by Tutankhamun's frail life. The boy king had symbolized innocence, restoration, and fragility. The old vizier who followed him embodied calculation, survival, and impermanence. Egypt endured, as it always did, but the shadows grew longer, for beneath the veneer of ritual stability, the question of true power remained unresolved, and waiting just beyond the horizon, with soldiers at his back and ambition in his heart, was the man who would seize it. Erased from memory, when A's brief reign came to its end and the weight of Egypt passed into new hands, the name of Tutankhamun, once sung in hymns, once carved proudly into temple walls, began to fade. It was not the natural forgetting of time, nor the gentle erosion of centuries, but an intentional silence, a deliberate act of erasure. The boy king, who had restored the gods, who had been the fragile vessel of Amun's renewed favor, was struck from the record, his memory condemned to oblivion by those who followed. The practice was not without precedent. In Egypt, memory itself was power. To remember a name was to keep its soul alive. To erase it was to condemn the spirit to a second death, more final than the first. Thus, when chisels struck against stone to carve away Tutankhamun's name, it was not merely politics, it was annihilation. Reliefs that had once depicted his offerings to the gods were recut to bear the names of successors. Statues were reinscribed, their faces left but their titles changed. His reign, so brief and fragile, was buried not only in his modest tomb but also in deliberate silence. Why was he erased? Some say it was because of his blood, the taint of the Amarna line, the legacy of Akhenaten that Egypt sought to forget. To remember Tutankhamun was to remember his heretic kin, the shadow of the Aten that had once eclipsed the gods. Others claim it was political convenience. I, and later Horemheb, had little desire to honor a child king whose reign was defined by their own guidance. They wished to cast themselves not as successors but as restorers, as the ones who had delivered Egypt from heresy. To achieve this, Tutankhamun had to vanish, his role diminished, his name erased, so that their narratives might shine more brightly. In the grand temples, where pharaohs were immortalized, Tutankhamun's absence was striking. His name was omitted from king lists inscribed by later dynasties. His statues, if they survived, were altered to bear other names. His tomb, hidden and modest, escaped looting in part because it was forgotten, overshadowed by the greater monuments of more celebrated kings. For centuries, his reign was a blank space, a silence in the otherwise continuous chorus of Egypt's kingship. And yet, erasure is never complete. In the hidden places of the Valley of the Kings, his tomb remained, sealed with its treasures. In the whispers of foreign archives, his queen's desperate letter preserved his memory. In the soil of Egypt, objects inscribed with his name lay buried, waiting for a distant age to uncover them. Though the chisels of his successors struck hard, they could not erase every trace. The boy king lingered, unseen but not wholly gone, his memory like embers hidden beneath ash. For Ankhesenamun, if she still lived to see it, the erasure must have been salt upon the wound. To lose her husband in youth was tragedy enough. To see his name obliterated, his legacy silenced, was to watch him die a second death. Whether she still walked the palace halls or whether she too had vanished by this time, we cannot say. but the silence of his name echoed most loudly for those who had once spoken it in love. For Ai and Horemheb, the erasure served their ambitions. Ai's legitimacy was fragile, and so he sought to diminish his predecessor. Horemheb, when at last he seized the throne, went further still, branding himself the great restorer, the avenger of heresy, the pharaoh who erased not only Tutankhamun but the entire Amarna line from memory. To him, history was a tool, and by striking out the names of those before him, he carved his own legacy as savior. And thus, Tutankhamun's reign passed into darkness. His treasures lay sealed in silence, his name omitted from the annals, his story reduced to whispers. The boy who had once carried the weight of the gods, who had walked in gold before his people, became a forgotten shadow. Only the silent tomb bore witness, its chambers crowded with treasures untouched by time, waiting for a day when chisels and erasures could no longer silence him. The erasure was meant to be eternal, but eternity has its ironies. For while mightier kings were plundered and their names remembered only by scholars, Tutankhamun's obscurity preserved him. His silence became his protection, his erasure the key to his rediscovery. But for the centuries that followed, he was gone, lost, nameless, erased from memory, his body lying in shadow, his soul perhaps restless in the underworld, waiting for his name to be spoken again. The tomb forgotten, the Valley of the Kings, with its rugged cliffs rising like sentinels above the western bank of the Nile, was a place where silence reigned and eternity was written in stone. Here, the mightiest pharaohs of Egypt had carved their eternal dwellings deep into the earth, filling them with treasures, inscriptions, and prayers meant to guide them through the perilous journey of the afterlife. And here too, in a tomb smaller than most, hurriedly prepared and hidden almost by accident, Tutankhamun was laid to rest. Yet unlike the grand sepulchres of Ramses or Seti, his burial chamber was modest, and in that modesty lay its concealment. The world moved on, and the tomb of the boy king slipped into obscurity. The entrance, once marked by the seals of the necropolis, was soon covered by debris and forgotten. Workmen carving new tombs in the valley discarded rubble carelessly, and over years the stones piled higher, burying the doorway of Tutankhamun's tomb beneath layers of sand and gravel. Even the builders of later pharaohs may have walked over it without realizing what lay beneath their feet. The valley shifted and changed with each passing reign, and in that slow transformation, the boy's resting place vanished from memory, swallowed by the landscape. The erasure of his name ensured that no rituals were performed for him, no anniversaries of his death commemorated, no festivals carried his image. His tomb was left unvisited by priests who maintained the cults of greater kings. In the long centuries that followed, as dynasties rose and fell, as Libyans, Nubians, Persians, and later Greeks laid claim to Egypt, Tutankhamun was as if he had never lived. The people who had once bowed before him died, their children forgot, and his name, stricken from the king lists, was lost in the great tide of time. Yet the tomb endured in silence, untouched by the looters who ravaged the valley. Other pharaohs, with grander monuments and richer reputations, were less fortunate. Their sepulchres were broken into, their treasures stolen, their mummies desecrated. Ramses and Thutmose, Seti and Amenhotep, all fell victim to thieves who braved curses for the sake of gold. But Tutankhamun's tomb, small and hidden, escaped notice. In being forgotten, it was preserved. The treasures piled hastily around his body remained undisturbed, their gold untarnished, their jewels gleaming in the eternal dark. The mask that bore his likeness, serene and radiant, waited in silence for centuries, unseen by human eyes. Still, the tomb was not wholly without disturbance. In later times, workmen digging nearby tombs may have broken into its outer chambers, leaving behind signs of intrusion. Some goods were displaced, some seals broken, yet the core remained intact. The burial chamber, crowded with shrines, coffins, and treasures, kept its secrets, protected not by vigilance but by neglect. In the Valley of the Kings, grandeur drew attention, obscurity invited survival, and so, for over 3,000 years, Tutankhamun's tomb lay hidden, its presence erased from human knowledge. Dynasties rose, empires fell, new religions swept across Egypt, and still the boy king lay in silence. Even as Greek scholars wrote of Egypt's marvels, even as Roman emperors gazed upon its monuments, none knew of the treasures sealed beneath the valley floor. Sand shifted, stones fell, and the tomb remained, waiting like a memory suppressed but never destroyed. It is strange to think that during all those centuries, travelers may have camped above it, shepherds may have led their flocks across the ground, children may have played upon the very stones that sealed the entrance, and yet none knew. The boy king, once erased from memory, became the most hidden of pharaohs, his silence deeper than that of any ruler before or after him. The forgotten tomb became his legacy. It was not the temples he restored, nor the policies he enacted, nor the fragile peace of his reign that would carry his name forward, but the silence of his burial chamber. It was the forgotten place, buried beneath rubble, overlooked by time, that ensured Tutankhamun would one day rise again in the eyes of the world. But for centuries uncounted, it remained what it had been. At the moment the stones were rolled into place, a silent tomb, unvisited, unseen, holding in its darkness both the fragility of a boy's life and the grandeur of Egypt's eternal dream, the body that vanished. The silence of Tutankhamun's tomb was not without its mysteries, and none more haunting than the fate of the boy's own body. For though the treasures of gold, alabaster, and lapis lay sealed in darkness, his remains bore strange marks, puzzles that would trouble those who uncovered them millennia later, and which even in his own time may have stirred whispers of unease. It was said that his burial was hurried, that the embalming was flawed, that something unusual had occurred in the treatment of his corpse. And so, even in death, Tutankhamun's body became the subject of suspicion, the center of rumors that his very flesh had not found peace. The ancient embalmers had followed tradition as best they could, but the boy's body showed signs of haste or error. The flesh bore burns, as though scorched by fire or chemical reaction. The bones appeared brittle, the wrappings imperfect. In later centuries, when modern eyes peered upon him, they found strange fractures, a broken leg, a damaged skull, wounds that did not fit neatly into ritual explanation. Were these the results of accident? Perhaps a fall from a chariot, as some suggested? Or were they the marks of conspiracy, of violence inflicted in life or in death? No inscription explained them, and the silence of the tomb kept its secrets. Whispers arose, even in antiquity. Some believed the boy king had been murdered, struck down by rivals eager for power. Others said his body had been desecrated, mishandled in the rush to bury him before the delicate balance of Egypt unraveled. Still others imagined divine punishment, that the gods themselves had seared him for the sins of his lineage, marking his flesh as a warning to all who followed. Whatever the truth, the mystery clung to his body, unsettling those who guarded his memory, and strengthening the resolve of those who sought to erase him. For a king's body was not merely flesh, it was the anchor of his immortality. To disturb it was to risk disturbing the very soul. And so, some stories whispered that his remains did not remain long in their tomb. It was said by a few that the priests of later dynasties, angered by the Amarna bloodline, may have moved him, stripping his name and shifting his body to another resting place, or even destroying it altogether. Others hinted that robbers, long before the tomb was forgotten, had attempted to carry away not only treasures, but the king himself, only to leave behind a desecrated form. These were rumors, carried across centuries like dust on the wind, but they fed the mystery of the vanished body. When the tomb was at last rediscovered in modern times, the boy's corpse was indeed present, but damaged, fragile, and incomplete. It seemed almost as though it had been attacked not only by time but by fire, by pressure, by something unnatural. His body had survived, yet in surviving, it had raised more questions than answers. Did his body truly rest where it was placed, or had it been moved, altered, mistreated before being returned? Did those who buried him fear him, or seek to hide something, or simply falter in their craft? To the ancients, such mysteries would have been perilous. A pharaoh's body was sacred, its preservation essential for his journey in the afterlife. If Tutankhamun's form was compromised, what did it mean for his soul? Was he condemned to wander, restless, denied the fields of reeds where the blessed dead walked forever in joy? Or did the gods grant mercy, overlooking the failings of men, guiding the boy king to eternity despite the flaws of his burial. These were questions no priest would dare answer, for to speak them aloud was to risk unraveling the very promise of immortality. Thus, the body of Tutankhamun, meant to be a vessel of eternal peace, became instead a riddle. In life he had been frail, in death he was broken, and in memory he was erased. Yet even erased, his remains endured, fragile but present, bearing silent witness to mysteries unsolved. Whether truly vanished, desecrated, or hidden, his body became a symbol of all that was fragile in kingship, of how even a pharaoh could be undone by illness, by intrigue, by the careless hands of time. And so, the body that was meant to anchor eternity became a ghost, its fate debated across ages. In the Valley of the Kings, his treasures waited in silence, but his very flesh carried the imprint of tragedy, of secrecy, of disappearance. It was as if the gods themselves had conspired to keep his story unfinished, his body both present and absent, his death both real and uncertain. The boy who had once been erased from memory was also the king whose body, even in its tomb, seemed to vanish into mystery. The Valley's Watchers. For centuries after Tutankhamun's hurried burial, the Valley of the Kings did not sleep undisturbed. Though the cliffs rose like eternal guardians and the silence of the desert seemed absolute, there were always watchers, priests, robbers, workmen, and kings themselves who prowled its pathways, seeking either to preserve or to plunder the secrets within. The tombs of the pharaohs, filled with treasures meant to last for eternity, called irresistibly to both reverence and greed. Tutankhamun's resting place, small and hidden beneath rubble, escaped much of this fate. But the valley around him was never still, and the stories of its watchers intertwine with his own silence. The first watchers were the priests. In the centuries following the New Kingdom, when Egypt's power waned and foreign threats grew, priests were tasked with protecting the sanctity of the tombs. They moved mummies from plundered chambers into secret caches, stripping treasures to preserve at least the bodies of the kings. To them, the tombs were sacred ground, but they were also practical men, forced to choose preservation over splendor. It may be that Tutankhamun's erasure from king lists spared him this upheaval. Forgotten by history, he was left untouched, his body hidden beneath stone, as others were moved, rewrapped, and reburied in collective hiding places. But alongside the guardians came the robbers. The valley was rich beyond measure, and in times of famine or unrest, the lure of gold drew desperate men into the dark. Torches smoked against painted walls, picks struck plaster, seals were broken, and the dead were stripped of ornaments meant for eternity. Even the most sacred curses, those carved warnings that promised death to any who violated a tomb, did not deter them. For hunger and greed weigh heavier than fear of the unseen. Tutankhamun's tomb, by chance and concealment, remained mostly safe. Yet faint traces show that intruders may have entered briefly in antiquity, disturbing some objects but abandoning their theft before they reached the core. Perhaps the hurried nature of the burial made it less alluring, its entrance concealed by the rubble of later works. Whatever the reason, fortune protected it, even as greater tombs were despoiled. Then came the kings of later dynasties, whose builders carved new resting places into the valley, often directly over older tombs. Workmen toiled beneath the hot sun, cutting passages into the limestone, dumping rubble without care. It is likely that in the process of constructing new tombs, Tutankhamun's entrance was buried deeper still, hidden beneath debris from the cutting of later monuments. In this way, he became doubly concealed, erased by memory, covered by stone. The watchers of those later pharaohs walked unknowingly above his sealed chamber, their footsteps echoing on ground that concealed the boy king's treasures. Centuries passed, dynasties fell, and the valley itself was forgotten by the living, its cliffs standing silent over tombs already emptied or decayed. Shepherds and villagers passed through without knowing the kings who slept beneath their feet. The desert winds swept across the entrances, filling them with sand, erasing the last traces of pathways once worn by priests and mourners. The watchers became ghosts, their vigilance ended, leaving only silence and stone. And yet, the valley was never entirely abandoned. Even in later ages, when Greeks and Romans came to Egypt, when travelers marveled at the pyramids and the temples, Some found their way to the Valley of the Kings. Tombs already broken into were explored, fragments of treasures carried away. But Tutankhamun's tomb, still hidden, remained unknown, its watchers replaced by chance itself, which guarded it better than any soldier or priest. In this long silence, Tutankhamun's story seemed destined never to return. His name was gone, his monuments usurped, his tomb hidden beneath rubble. But the valley has always had watchers, sometimes of flesh, sometimes of fate itself. For though centuries passed without discovery, the boy king's resting place waited patiently, as though guarded not by priests or curses, but by the desert's own hand. The cliffs stood watch, the sands concealed, and in that concealment lay preservation. Thus the Valley of the Kings, so often disturbed, became paradoxically the protector of its most fragile pharaoh. While mightier kings were robbed and their bodies moved, Tutankhamun endured in obscurity, surrounded by treasures piled hastily in cramped chambers. His watchers were not men but time itself, ensuring that one day, long after his name had been erased, he would be revealed anew. The rediscovery. For more than 3,000 years the Valley of the Kings lay quiet, its cliffs still beneath the sun, its tombs sealed beneath rubble and silence. Great pharaohs who had once commanded armies and built monuments slept there in darkness, their treasures stolen, their bodies disturbed. Only one boy, long forgotten, lay hidden in his modest tomb, his memory erased, but his chamber intact. Time itself had become his guardian, and it waited until the modern age, when curiosity and perseverance would pierce the valley's silence and reveal the secrets sealed away by chance. The rediscovery came not through accident alone, but through the stubborn will of one man, Howard Carter. An English archaeologist of unyielding patience, Carter had spent years exploring the valley under the patronage of Lord Carnarvon, searching for something that eluded others. Many believed the valley had given up all its secrets, that every tomb had been found, looted, or studied. Carter refused to believe this. He trusted scraps of evidence, fragments of pottery, and faint records that suggested one king, barely remembered, might still lie hidden. Tutankhamun, whose name had been erased from lists but not from every artifact. Year after year, Carter searched, his excavations yielding little but dust and disappointment. Funds dwindled, and even his patron grew weary. Yet Carter persisted, convinced that one tomb remained. His workers cleared rubble, sifted sand, and traced the faint outlines of ancient pathways. Then, in November of 1922, as the sun blazed upon the valley, a young water boy stumbled upon a stone step buried in the sand. Carter ordered his men to dig, and soon a staircase emerged, descending into the earth. At its base lay a sealed doorway stamped with the necropolis seals unbroken, untouched. Carter's heart must have pounded as he read the faint cartouches. The name of Tutankhamun, forgotten for centuries, reappeared in the dust of discovery. Carter sent for Lord Carnarvon, and together they prepared to breach the tomb. On the 26th of November, Carter stood with trembling hands before the sealed door. He made a small breach, and through the hole held up a candle. The air within, sealed for millennia, rushed out, carrying the scent of ages. In the flickering light, Carter glimpsed wonders beyond imagining. Golden couches shaped like lions, chariots gleaming, statues of gods, alabaster vessels. When Carnarvon, unable to restrain himself, asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter replied with words that have echoed ever since. "Yes, wonderful things." The world was stunned. In an age when tombs had been stripped bare, here was one nearly intact, overflowing with treasures that had not been touched since the day they were sealed. For weeks and months, Carter and his team catalogued, photographed, and removed the objects, each more dazzling than the last. Beds shaped like divine beasts, jewelry of gold and lapis, shrines that nested within one another like protective shells. And at the heart of it all, the golden mask that became the very image of ancient Egypt, the serene, youthful face of Tutankhamun, immortalized in gold, his gaze calm, his expression eternal. Yet even in this triumph, shadows lingered. The boy's body, when unwrapped, revealed its secrets reluctantly. Carter and the physicians who examined him found the frailties, the fractures, the burns that puzzled even modern science. Theories multiplied. Accident, assassination, disease, mishandled embalming. The mystery of his death and the strange state of his remains only deepened. And with the discovery came also tales of a curse. Lord Carnarvon died shortly after entering the tomb, his sudden illness feeding stories of ancient vengeance. Others connected deaths and misfortunes among those involved to the wrath of the king whose rest had been disturbed. Whether superstition or coincidence, the idea of the pharaoh's curse captured imaginations worldwide, binding Tutankhamun's rediscovery to a myth as powerful as his treasures. The boy who had been erased from history now became its most famous pharaoh. Newspapers across the world carried his name. Scholars debated his life. Artists reproduced his treasures. His mask, his chariots, his statues were admired not only as relics of Egypt but as icons of mystery and beauty. Ironically, the king meant to be forgotten became the one remembered above all others. His treasures displayed in museums, his story retold in countless voices. Yet the rediscovery did not solve the riddles of his life. It raised them anew. Why had he died so young? Why was his tomb so small, his burial so hasty? What was the meaning of the burns upon his body, the fractures in his bones, and what had truly become of his queen, Ankhesenamun, whose voice vanished as suddenly as his own life? These questions lingered, unanswered, ensuring that Tutankhamun remained not only a figure of gold and glory, but also of haunting mystery. Thus, in the rediscovery, the silent tomb gave voice once more. The boy who had been hidden by time returned, his treasures dazzling the world, his story revived, his name spoken after centuries of silence. But even in the glare of electric lights upon his golden mask, even in the pages of scholars and newspapers, the shadows remained. Tutankhamun had been found, yet the truth of his life and death remained elusive, as if the gods themselves still guarded the secrets of the boy king whose body had vanished into mystery. Mystery without end. Even with the tomb opened, its treasures revealed, and the boy king's name once more upon the lips of the world, Tutankhamun remains a figure wrapped in questions. His golden mask gazes out with serene certainty, yet behind that calm visage lies a story fractured and incomplete. The rediscovery that should have brought clarity instead deepened the enigma, for every artifact raised new riddles, every examination of his body stirred more doubt than certainty. It was as though the gods had decreed that Tutankhamun's destiny was not to be understood but to remain forever cloaked in wonder. The questions begin with his death. Scholars have argued across decades whether he died of illness, accident, or conspiracy. Some point to evidence of malaria in his remains, to signs of congenital weakness, to the frail bones of a boy cursed by the interwoven marriages of his dynasty. Others focus on the broken leg, the fractured skull, the strange burns that mark his body traces, that could suggest an accident in a chariot or a violent end at the hands of rivals. Still others suggest that the burns and disfigurements came not from murder, but from mistakes in embalming, from chemical reactions in the oils that scorched his flesh within the sealed chamber. Each theory holds fragments of truth, yet none offers final certainty. Then there is the matter of his burial. Why was his tomb so small, so hastily prepared, when even lesser kings commanded greater monuments? Was his death so unexpected that no grand resting place had been made ready? Or was it deliberate that his successors, eager to erase him, granted him only a modest chamber, hoping his memory would fade with the swiftness of his burial? The treasures within, though splendid, were crowded, many of them perhaps repurposed from other burials, as if borrowed in haste. Even the golden mask, some suggest, may not have been made for him, but for a queen, its features bearing the faint echo of another face, reshaped to become his. If true, even his most famous relic is a palimpsest of forgotten stories. And what of Ankhesenamun? Her desperate letter to the Hittites, her fleeting appearance upon a ring beside Ai's name, and then her disappearance into silence. These fragments remain her only legacy. Did she live as Ai's consort, erased from memory by the priests? Did she resist and meet a darker fate? Was she exiled, forgotten, buried without inscription? Her voice, preserved only in that letter of desperation, is like a candle flickering briefly in the vast dark of history. She too is a mystery without end, her story entwined with Tutankhamun's, both young lives swallowed by forces larger than themselves. Yet, perhaps the greatest enigma is not the circumstances of his death, nor the flaws of his burial, nor the vanishing of his queen, but the paradox of his memory. In his own time, Tutankhamun was erased, forgotten by design. He was not meant to be remembered. His reign struck from lists, his name chiseled away, his tomb buried beneath rubble. And yet, by that very act of forgetting, he was preserved. The mightiest kings of Egypt were plundered, their mummies scattered, their treasures stolen. Tutankhamun, overlooked, survived whole. His name, once silenced, now echoes louder than any other pharaoh's. His image, once erased, now shines from museum halls and books, recognized across the world as the face of ancient Egypt. This irony, this inversion of memory is itself a mystery. Did the gods, who had guided his fragile life, decide also to guard his legacy? Was the boy king, so frail in life, chosen in death to embody eternity more perfectly than warriors or builders could? His reign was brief, his deeds modest, yet his tomb has made him immortal. Perhaps this is the truest secret of Tutankhamun, that power lies not in conquest or monuments, but in the quiet persistence of mystery, in the fascination of what cannot be explained. And so, his story endures. Each generation peers into his golden mask and asks anew, who was he? Why did he die? What became of his queen? What secrets still lie hidden in the Valley of the Kings? The answers shift like desert sands, revealing glimpses before vanishing again. His silence calls to us across millennia, not with certainty, but with wonder. Thus the boy king, once erased, once forgotten, now reigns again not as a pharaoh of armies or temples, but as a pharaoh of mystery. His story is unfinished, his body broken, his name resurrected. In him, we see both the grandeur of Egypt and its shadows, both the brilliance of gold and the silence of the tomb. Tutankhamun is not only a king of the past, he is a riddle for all time, a flame that flickers still, a mystery without end.